Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for tuning in to this episode. I have another guest for you that is on the ballot for 2020. This is Scott Andrew Yang, a district attorney in the county of Los Angeles, who is on the ballot hoping to be moved up to judge. Now, this is something that it runs twofold, right? Judges are usually either elected by somebody else higher up in the food chain, or they can also be elected by the people. It's just part of the process. They want to have a give and take there, right? They want some people elected by others, and some people have to be elected by the people. And when I took some time to do my research on who to vote for, I myself found that some people were harder to discover than others, and some people surrounded themselves by different types of people. And when I came across Scott Andrew Yang's information and how easy he was to be accessed publicly, given the type of work that he does, and the fact that he has a passion for defending people who have experienced sex crimes, it really painted a picture for me for someone that I wanted to get to know better and talk to and bring to your attention, and also show you the types of questions you might want to ask. Now, this is somebody who doesn't come from an affluent background, but made something out of his life, and is of Asian descent, and showcases a story that allows empathy to take place with people of all ethnicities, not just one. And I think that's important to take into consideration. So without further ado, because the episode in itself is really a powerful story, I bring to you Scott Andrew Yang. Hey, Scott.
Yes, sir.
So a very basic podcast. It originally was a career-driven podcast for teaching people who were looking to shift careers or start a new career on what that looks like a day in the life. Let's say, for an example, of a district attorney, if that was a path somebody wanted to take and they were young. But given the time and given the current political climate and to social climate, it's important, I think, to bridge the gap between both worlds. Now, I spoke with two other people for different parts. They were on different positions of the ballot. One was Sharnae Tunson, the other Mayana Dellinger so far.
Okay.
And I'm very thankful to also be able to be speaking with you. So basically, if you can reveal anything about like how it is someone should do research, also what your platform is, some things that people may not know about the responsibilities of your role and how much influence you actually have. And then finally, I'll bring it to a close with a summary and offer you the red carpet to promote anything you'd like to promote. Sounds good?
Okay. Sounds good. I appreciate that. Sounds extremely fair. I will say that before I begin saying anything, I think that judicial candidates are a little bit more unique than your traditional political candidates who are running for different offices. Mm-hmm. Judicial candidates are actually guided by Canon 5 of judicial ethics, which is promulgated by the American Bar Association. And what that basically means is that judicial candidates cannot comment on anything, on any particular political issues or issues that potentially can be, basically appear before the court, and we would have to make a ruling if I'm so honored to be able to win. So that being said, I think that if the question in terms of how do you research for a judicial candidate, I think a good, broad research on Google as to what has this particular candidate done in their lives, right? You can go to my website or even my opponent's website and have a read through in terms of what our background is like. But certainly our own website is going to tell you essentially, well, lack of a better term, good things about us, right? And they tend not to have any negatives or anything like that. So I would do, just a straightforward Google search on the name of the candidate and to see what sort of comes up. Then I would look into, in terms of the extensive opinion pieces that have been written on both of us, and there sort of be the judge as to which candidate is more in line with what the voter is looking for. And also look at our endorsements in terms of who have endorsed us, which organizations, which individuals, I think is also extremely telling. And our background, what have we done in our lives and what the motivation really is. My opponent has been endorsed by the LA Times. And the interesting thing about that is they didn't write much in terms of why they believed that my opponent is superior to me. We both were rated by the LA County Bar Association as being well qualified for the position, which makes the choice even more difficult, right? In terms of it's much simpler when one person's well qualified and the other isn't. But here we're both well qualified. So now the average voter has to sort of look into further as to, well, they're both well qualified, then what makes one person stand above? And I think that comes down to integrity. Has either one of the candidates said or done anything that sort of, skirts the truth? And I would challenge anybody to find anything in my background as far as have I ever said anything that is, sort of walking on the line between a truth and a lie. And I've never done anything like that. I've spent my entire career, basically the first 5 years in civil litigation in both state and federal court. I did a bulk of my time during my civil practice representing pro bono. A lot of families who were, because I grew up poor. I grew up in Echo Park during the 1980s.
Yeah.
And
wow.
So during the 80s, I know, right?
Echo Park 80s. Yeah, that's big.
Echo Park 80s. Yeah, I went to Betty Placencia Elementary School, which was formerly called Cortez Avenue or Cortez Street Elementary. I went to Virgil Junior High School right on Vermont.
Yeah.
And between, I think it's Beverly and First Street. And then I was one of the bus kids who happened to fall right in the border for U.S. Ulysses Grant High School in Van Nuys. So I was bused to Van Nuys every day, and then I eventually got to UCLA and I graduated in '97, and then I went to Southwestern University School of Law. So after having spent 5 years in civil practice, my mom passed away in 2006, and it sort of brought me back to sort of the basics in my life. I was getting a little tired of just working and hustling for private clients, and the practice, those at many times it was much more lucrative being in public practice. I sold my office and joined the district attorney's office in 2008. Ironically, I actually had applied for the public defender's office as well during that time, but the DA's office hired me first, and
really?
So I joined. Yeah, and Steve Cooley offered me the job, and so I took it. And I think it was like several months later that the public defender's office asked, if I was still interested. And by that time, I was already past my training period in the DA's office. So I started with the DA's office in 2008, and I've been there ever since. So I've spent almost 13 years. It will be 13 years May of next year. And immediately I gravitated toward prosecuting specific types of crimes, which were sex crimes and child molestation and child abuse. And I spent pretty much the last 8 years doing that. Right now, I'm assigned to the Sex Crimes Special Unit Division downtown of the DA's office. And prior to that, I spent 10 years in the Antelope Valley in a unit called the VIP unit. It's kind of a weird name, but it stands for Victim Impact Program. And we worked very closely with the Special Victims Bureau of the Sheriff's Department in Antelope Valley. And I was, several years ago, I was assigned the case of Gabriel Fernandez. I don't know if you heard of him. And so John Hatami and I were both assigned to the case, and we did the trial in 2017. And at that point, I said I was getting a little tired of looking at crime scene photos of children.
Sure.
So I asked to be transferred to the sex crimes unit downtown. And since then, I've been doing, serial rapists and child molestation cases. So I like to think that I've, have dedicated my life the last almost decade or so to specifically fighting for those most vulnerable in our society. I could have gone to the hardcore gangs division or major narcotics or, a variety of those type of specialized units, but I chose specifically sex crimes and BIP because they're the most meaningful type of work, I think, where you have people who have been most severely impacted at the hands of someone else. So I'm proud of my record. I'm extremely proud of what I've done, and I could have made more money, I guess, in private practice, but I enjoy what I do. After this period of time, I decided that I didn't want to be an advocate anymore. I think I have enough experience to be a neutral, to sit in the bench and to see the evidence and hear both sides. Sorry, that was my daughter in the background.
You're fine.
So at this point in my career, I felt that it was, at a point where I have seen enough in terms of litigation. I have almost 100 jury trials under my belt, and I'm talking about almost 100, jury trials having jurors. And this is one of the major distinction I have with my opponent is he tends to like to skirt the truth a little bit. And he says he has 500 trials, which is fairly, it sounds really good, 500 trials, but he never really says jury trials because he's counting bench trials, he's counting temporary restraining order hearings, he's counting preliminary hearings, he's counting basically any contested hearings as a trial.
And there is a difference.
There is a difference, absolutely. In fact, one of the longest trials I had was in Gabriel. That lasted almost 4.5 months. So we're talking about living the case for 4.5 months, in addition to the 3 years before that where we were doing motions. There's a distinction there. And so if based on that calculation, and I did recently look into how many preliminary hearings I've done and motions, I have almost 2,000 preliminary hearings and motions.
Right, if it's a matter of quantity.
Right, exactly. But when we're specifically talking about jury trial preparation and, standing in front of, members of the community and arguing the evidence, I have almost 100. And I think that's a very tough number for my opponent to meet. And that's why he's using the larger number by adding in hearings. But,
right.
Because there are prosecutors and very well-respected defense attorneys whom I know who've got 35 years under their belt. And when I asked them, do you have anything near 500? They're sort of laughing. They say that's not humanly possible to do.
Right. When it comes to 4-month-long cases, each one is taking half a year almost. Yeah.
Right. I mean, the average trial I have is 2 weeks. So, and I think there was 1 year where I actually did 14 jury trials, and that was, that was an
hell of a year. Yeah.
Extremely right. It's a hell of a year, pretty packed in there, right? So, and that was a lot. So even if you times that by 10, you're talking, 140 jury trials. And even if you multiply that by 20, that's 280. So, it's just an outrageous number. But, and so you look at these kind of things, the kind of experience that I have, and not just my background, but the training I've received and the experience that I've been able to obtain. And I've seen everything from both sides. I've seen prosecutors who've been heavy-handed, to, defense attorneys who, like to skirt the truth. And I've seen phenomenal lawyering from both the prosecution side as well as the defense side. So, I think that on a comparatively level playing field, comparing apples to apples and oranges to oranges, I think I like to believe that I'm a better candidate for the job. And I hope that I can bring that experience to the bench and help move justice along. And that sounds really corny, right? When we say move justice along, but I think one of the critical factors that judges should have, one of the great characteristics, is humility.
Sure.
Oftentimes judges, sort of put on the robe and somehow feel or believe that, sometimes they might, I would say, even forget that they are still the servants of the people. And
right, that's an important
I can
thing
tell
to remember.
right. I remember when my parents had a little business in Monterey Park, and they did not understand what a triple net lease was. They thought that when they signed a lease, whatever their rent every month is what they paid.
Right.
But they didn't understand that the landlord can tack on, common area fees, taxes, and whatnot, and give them an extra bill toward the end of the year. And so, they ended up being evicted and then going to court. And of course, my parents didn't have any money. So they went into court not having, a total understanding of how the process worked.
Oh, I see.
Basically, right. So basically, they were scared.
Sure. I mean,
okay.
Yeah.
And right. So you have a judge who sits there, and you have the landlord with his attorneys, and you go in basically not knowing anything. And I remember, my dad saying, I remember him saying, look, we went to court and I couldn't say these things. I couldn't tell the judge, I didn't feel like I could tell him everything from my side, even though he brought in an interpreter. And, the judge sort of kept on telling him, look, I don't want to hear it. So I think the important part of being a good neutral is, just show somebody respect. Sometimes people, I don't think everyone who walks into court expects to win.
Sure.
But they do expect to be treated fairly and to have at least an opportunity to be heard. And I think oftentimes, we sort of forget that when someone walks into court, they just want a fair shake. They just want someone who says, okay, please go ahead and tell me what it is, and ask questions, in a respectful manner. And even if they were to lose and walk out of court having lost, at least they feel like they've had a fair shake. And that's what I hope to bring to the bench.
No, that's
that
great.
Empathy.
I can see how an experience like that might have inspired a career in law in general.
Yeah.
I mean, aside from the fact that you come from a background that is looking to build for the first time ever as a generation in the States and Americas, to then also take it to the next level and study litigation and things of that nature. Now, I do know that trials that are tried by jury are different from other trials, such as ones that may involve sort of like a lease and so things of that nature. So when it comes to being a judge in a trial by jury, right, that's where most people are tried by their peers. And I was wondering if you could give me more insight into how it is the judge uses the information by the jury, and not just the other prosecutors and defendants, but public defenders. I mean, how is it that you come to your conclusion? Because I imagine, is it the jury that gives the final word on what's going on what the sentence is going to be, or is it the judge that takes the jury's verdict and then determines whether that sentence is fair or not?
Sure, that's an excellent question. Jury trials, basically originates from the Sixth Amendment, and you have an absolute right to a jury trial, but you also have a right to waive that jury trial and have your case be heard by a judge, right? A bench officer. So it's a bench trial. Oftentimes, defendants simply will not agree to a judge hearing the case because, the judge oftentimes is not that easily swayed by emotions, by lawyering, or anything similar to that. So oftentimes people will assert their right to a jury trial. And so we pick jurors from the public. maybe not right now because of the pandemic, but
Sure.
when it was going on, misdemeanor jury trials, both sides were entitled to basically pick from a pool of 35. And if it's a life felony, then they have 65, right? And so what we are looking for obviously both sides are looking for the most favorable jurors
Sure.
for their particular case or crime. And so what I generally look for, and it's kind of weird, I think every attorney sort of has their own way of looking at things, okay? I understand that when I ask a certain question of a juror, and we ask the standard questions, it's also an opportunity for us to sort of introduce some of the basic facts of our case to the panel, right? And we test to the jurors some weaknesses in our case, just to see what their response is.
Okay.
Give you an example. Because I do a lot of sex crimes cases, oftentimes my victims are children. And children tend to clam up when they're sitting in front of an audience and an adult is asking them questions. And when they clam up, sometimes they'll just nod their head, shake their head, or they'll say something, briefly, just so that they can answer the questions.
Right.
And sometimes under cross-examination, younger children tend to just agree for the sake of agreeing, okay, without having thought through their answers. And sometimes a good defense attorney can make it look as if the child is lying. You know what I'm saying?
Wow.
So, yeah, so a good defense attorney will ask the child, "Are you sure dad or your uncle or someone touched you down there?" And when you say down there, you're talking about your leg, right? Or your thigh.
Right.
And the child, even though they know that's not the answer, they'll say yes, just so that the person will stop asking them questions.
Yeah.
So I broach that so I will bring that before a jury right away. I will ask them, anybody here believes that a child will answer questions just so that they can stop the questioning. It's kind of a broad and general topic. Then we get narrower and ask, anybody here believes that children can oftentimes mistaken certain things, but ultimately still tell the truth about what had happened. And after that, I usually ask, questions like, anybody here baseball fans? It sounds really dumb, right? But baseball fans or basketball fans. And I ask, well, who won the last NBA championship? And everybody raised their hands, It's the Lakers. Okay.
Right.
What was the score? And you'll get 5 different answers, Oh, it was 118 to 106 or 118 to 108. Okay. And I would tell them the exact score. Okay, sir, prospective juror number 5. Sir, you said it was 118 to 106. Okay. It was actually 120 to 108. Okay. Sir, were you lying when you told me it was 118 to 108?
I see.
And he would say, no, I wasn't lying, but your memory is just different, right? You just forgot the numbers, right? Yeah. Does that change the fact that the Lakers won? No. And so that's kind of like the things I help to illustrate that even though we can make small mistakes in terms of the scores or how many assists or how many points a certain player makes, it doesn't really change the fact that the Lakers in fact did win.
So when a child, yeah, right.
Right. So a child is even worse.
Yeah.
A child's going to say, well, it was 60 to 115. But it doesn't change the fact that the child still has this, and that.
Right. That it still happened. Yeah.
Right. It still happened. But I don't file cases. At least that's my office's policies. We don't file just from one child's reporting. That's not enough for us to file. We need further corroboration. So oftentimes it would be multiple victims, right, who don't know each other, because that would show a pattern of conduct. Or there was DNA. In fact, I have a case right now where my defendant's 81 years old, and his 6-year-old granddaughter says that he had touched her, and he's denying. Well, we found DNA.
Oh, wow.
Inside of her, so that's a definite filing because it's undisputed.
Sure.
So it's one of those things where, I tend to be very careful when I file those type of cases because, you brand somebody with the scarlet letter of being a sex offender. I mean, that is destructive to someone's life.
Sure. And the other way around too, what it does to a child if it actually did happen.
Correct. Absolutely. And so it's that balancing factor, right, between what we can do and what we ought to do.
Right.
Are two very different things. And so I think that from the perspective, of having done that for many years, I think it's a very valuable thing that can be brought to
absolutely
to the court.
How does the role change when you now are placed in the seat of a judge versus a prosecutor or a public defender? With the way that you look at the jury?
Philip, that is such a great question, Philip. And I'll tell you this: a lot of people tend to think that prosecutors, once they get on the bench, they're going to be hard as nails, right? Because it's hard for them to take off the prosecutor's hat and put on a judge's hat. Okay,
right.
That's the conventional wisdom. And believe it or not, and I'm not saying all judges are like that, but there are always going to be a few who come to the bench and they have forgotten to take off their prosecutor's hat. Okay, but I think for the vast majority of prosecutors who take the bench, they tend to lean harder on the prosecution than they do on the defense, and vice versa. Lots of public defenders who take the bench tend to be much tougher on the defense than they are on the prosecution. So I asked a judge who was appointed by Governor Brown to the bench, who's a former public defender. And I asked him, why is it that you seem to be much tougher on the defense than you are on the people? And his answer to me was, because I know all the bullshit they play.
Right.
And that is so, and that's kind of, I'm sorry, was I not supposed to say that?
No, you're fine. No, you're fine.
Okay.
You're fine.
Okay.
Cursing is fine here. I don't have anything against it. In fact, I think it humanizes a little more because it's true that you can't sugarcoat that when it is something that people do. I mean, it's part of the art of litigation, right? It is an art. I know you have
correct.
To study
It is an art. Absolutely.
Theater arts.
Absolutely.
I looked into it when I was in college for like 2 semesters before I dropped out, but that's another story. But I was surprised because I have a background in acting. So I was like, theater arts for litigation, even if it's business law, it's a requirement to be able to present in a fashion that persuades.
Right. And that is such a critical skill to have. Had I known what I know now, I think I would have taken a lot more English classes and a few theater arts classes. It would make you a far better advocate. I think.
Tell me more about that. I mean, the career. Is there a looking back on it? Was there a shorter path to success to becoming an attorney? And just in the beginning, because I imagine it was a sort of up and down path, and it wasn't until looking back on it now that you're like, this could have been made so much easier if I had known.
Yeah, I think law school is not a fun place to be at. It certainly was very, very difficult, at least for me. I mean, I don't know about other attorneys, but for me, law school was very difficult because I just, I was sort of shocked when I was told that your entire grade for the class, rests on one final exam.
Oh, wow.
Okay. Every class is the same. No midterms, no papers, nothing. One final exam. That's it. Determines your grade for the entire semester. And that was a complete shock to me. How can that be? And it's graded on the forced curve, at least the law school that I went to. So it was very competitive. Everybody just sort of wanted to outmaneuver your fellow students. And had I known what those tests, my parents weren't attorneys. I went to law school with a couple of friends who now are good friends of mine whose fathers were attorneys, their grandfathers were lawyers. And so they sort of went in knowing that, you didn't have to worry about being called on when you're in class. Just stay focused on start preparing to write your final exams. And if you write those well, your grades will be great. And so I was, kind of dumb, just worrying about every day being in class, being called on. And while I was sweating that, these guys were kind of like relaxing, starting their outlines already. So, yeah, there are a few things I think would have made the law school experience for me a little easier. So I think that for at least the next generation, if any of my children decide they want to go into law school, I think it would be helpful for them. But unfortunately, none of my kids want to go into law. So, my oldest, my 20-year-old wants to be a school teacher, which I think is a great and noble profession to go into.
That's amazing, yeah.
So we kind of, I don't know if I can pass it on to my kids, but there's always a leg up when you're somebody in your family telling you this is what you should do or this is what you should expect.
Well, there might be an opportunity here in case anyone who's listening has been considering law school or is probably in the middle of it.
Yeah.
If you could offer them anything the way you would tell your kids, what would be one thing you could leave behind?
Absolutely. Don't worry about being called on in class. Sort of look, because some of my fellow students who did very well started practicing. They immediately went to grab all the old final exams.
Oh, wow.
And and they started learning how they started looking at those old final exams, and they start to see a pattern in terms of what that professor tend to like to ask. Certain topics or areas of that subject that they like to ask. And they start to practice writing out their exams. And they would bring it to the professors and say, hey, what do you think of this? What do you think of that? And the professor, most professors are generally very, they encourage their students to do those kind of things. So I'm not trying to say that the students, those particular students did anything wrong. But they just knew how to study. You know what I mean?
Right.
So they start writing out the exams, and they would bring it to the professor, and the professor would then give them, rough grading, and then give it back to them. Well, if you do that 3-4 times, eventually you're going to figure out what the professor likes.
Absolutely.
or doesn't like, right?
And you didn't do it.
Right. Well, I'm like sitting in the library, still trying to memorize the letter of the law.
Oh no!
Yeah, right. And that's just wasn't efficient use of my time.
Sure.
So and so that sort of made law school much more difficult. But I kind of figured that out after my second year. Well, after first year, going into my second year. But your grade and your class ranking and everything else really hinges on your first year in law school. So first year is very, very important. It's a learning it's a learning curve, and I have to say I'm extremely blessed that in spite of all that, I sort of got the training and the experience that I have, and I'm so grateful for that.
Yeah, no, that's amazing, and I'm searching for how else to get more information without budging into compliance, because I do work. I've worked with like attorneys for social media and things like that before, and also CPAs, and I know there's a lot of compliance around it because it can be dicey, and it's tough, especially on the fact that you are on the federal level to some degree on a lot of things that you're doing. So it does make it difficult to inquire. So some of the things I was hoping to ask you about in terms of like movements going on with like Black Lives Matter and all that. And I don't want to push, I don't want to press on that. But the reason I bring that up is because as a district attorney moving into the seat of a judge, as you know, the criminal justice system in general tends to be looked at in a certain way by a majority of people. And given your background, I know to some degree where you might lean just because there's empathy there. You're able to put yourself in those people's shoes and determine instead of what most people who might be removed from that reality and might have generations of family
Right.
who've been in this country and may not be necessarily a mixed race or of ethnic minority, who may have trouble
Sure.
empathizing or sympathizing with the certain things that are happening. I mean, nothing is perfect, and there's always two
Right.
sides, no matter how thin you slice the bread. But
There we go.
I imagine if you get elected, based on everything that a listener may have heard here, and sort of see the humanity behind you and where you're coming from, which I was able to hear resonate in the way you were expressing yourself, because there is a line to be towed there, without saying too much, right? I do
Yeah.
see how stepping into the seat as a judge and then having to deal with juries. Is there anything that a judge does the way you did as a prosecutor, where you would ask the jury to sort of get a sense for where the jury is at, and to sort of make your
Sure.
case? Is there something that a judge does to understand what the makeup of a jury is, or who is prosecuting and how that might influence? Because everyone has their biases.
Sure.
Is a judge responsible for looking at a prosecutor's history, a public defender's history, and the history of maybe some of the jurors to determine whether or not those are going to sway what the judge ultimately decides?
I think that the ultimate, the final outcome of a case, I think, still rests on the facts and the evidence. Okay.
Okay.
I do think that the skills of the advocate certainly helps to bring it to a particular outcome. But I do think that a judge sets the tone.
Mm.
You know what I mean? I think that the judge is able to bring to the table and bring to the particular trial a certain, it's hard to say, but a sort of a type of feeling for both sides. And what do I mean by that? For instance, if you have a judge, and someone said to me that you can learn trial skills, right? You can learn from a book. That, to a certain degree, I think is good. I think there are great books out there. Jerry Spence has one, and exactly what you said. Advocacy is an art. It's not a science. It has to do with the way that the advocate feels. You actually feel from the jury, from their body language, certain characteristics of jurors, impermissible characteristics, race, gender, disability, national origin, things of that nature, to ask the court to kick that juror off the panel. Okay?
Right.
And it's impermissible. But a good judge can listen and see. And sometimes lawyers, I've seen this from really good, experienced attorneys, defense lawyers, with lots of years of experience. They want certain groups off the panel, and they're determined to do it no matter what happens. So what they'll do is they won't kick consecutive jurors of that same group off the panel. See what I'm saying? Right. They're going to hopscotch, okay? And they're going to ask very pointed questions geared toward one particular group over another that oftentimes has nothing to do with the case. Absolutely nothing. And I think oftentimes a judge without a lot of trial experience might find those questions to be benign and not even see it. Okay? But if a judge who's had a lot of trial experience and have seen a whole myriad of trial tactics and strategies, he or she can pick that out and say, no, you're not going down that road. Okay? Even without a Wheeler or Batson admonition. And,
wow.
I don't know, a lot of people don't know this, but if a Wheeler Batson motion is granted by the judge, meaning that judge says, you've been kicking these people off this panel because of a certain characteristics, because of race, let's say, Okay. That attorney has to report himself or herself to the bar
Wow.
because it's considered discrimination.
Which is
And
why they develop tactics to do it in a way where it doesn't
that
seem
that's
obvious.
that's right.
But someone with your
That's
experience who understands the art of a pointed question and how to create a jury that is favorable puts you in a position where
right.
now, as a judge, you're able to see the tactics displayed by whether it's the defense or the prosecution
That's
and
correct.
determine, okay, I see what's going on here. And again,
Correct.
correct the tone of the proceeding.
Correct. That's right. And you can do it in such a way where you cut them off before it even starts. Because once you kick them off, that juror's gone. And you can't bring that juror. I mean, it's sort of technically you can bring them back. But
Sure.
depending on how the trial is going, you've lost that juror. You know? So it's kind of like whatever remedy you give at that point, that juror has been excluded. So what you want is to cut them off before that happens.
Sure.
You know?
And having
And
as having a judge who used to be an attorney who has the ability to empathize with multiple ethnicities and understands both the people who come from successful origins and the ones that don't is probably a more neutral choice to have than someone who comes from a long line of successful and affluent family success. You know what I mean? Like I think
and yeah, exactly. And yeah, I agree. And I think it's nothing that is, it's something you really can't be taught, but you're able to see it, and that's very critical. And because there's a lot of game playing in trial work, and it's the feeling that you get that you can justify it by seeing what's happening right in front of you.
hmm,
You know what I mean? And it's kind of funny, but I sat in a trial once and I said, here you go. And I even told I had a law clerk with me during the trial. And I said, this is what he's going to do. He's going to kick this one off. Okay. This person is white and everything. He's going to kick off this one and this one just to throw us a bone. And then he's going to kick her off,
wow.
you know? And it went almost exactly the way we said. I mean, it's like he's going to throw us the bone here and he's going to get rid of her. And you just know that was where he's aiming. And but that is, and I don't blame him. I think that he's being paid to do a job, or in the public defenders, for a public defender, it's doing a job.
Sure.
And honestly, I think most public defenders are far better litigators than private attorneys. Because I have tremendous respect for my public defender colleagues. They work so hard. They carry so many cases and they do their darnest. They do their darnest, and and they're in trial with us all the time. And so I tip my hat to them because they are truly in the trenches, especially now during the pandemic. They're the ones who have to go down to the jails and talk to their clients.
Sure.
They're the ones who are exposing themselves day in, day out. And I think the public just really don't realize how the people within our society don't realize how hard the public defenders work. A lot of people think that I'm a prosecutor and I have no public defender friends. I just have prosecutors. That's not even near the truth. Half of my friends are public defenders and half of my friends are prosecutors. And, we just respect the work that we all do and not bring to the table anything that's personal against each other. And I think that's a tremendous experience and asset that all of us bring to society by being that way. So, I agree with you. I think that the broader experience someone has makes them a much more, maybe diverse is not the right word, but makes them more worldly in terms of being able to see things and the nuances that someone who hasn't had the experience might miss. That's all.
Yeah. No. Excuse me. I think that was well put, and really, there's really nothing much left for me to ask other than, is there anything you'd like to say to a listener listening now that all this has been shared, that they should take into consideration once again as to why they should really strongly lean towards thinking about yourself for that vote. Again, a lot of people are wary of politics these days, and it makes
Yeah,
it hard for them to know who to vote for when they weren't educated as to how to do their
sure,
research. And to top it off,
sure.
I hear it's very expensive to even put a 200 word summary of who you are on even the sample ballot. It's something
Yeah,
outrageous, and then you yourself have to put up some of your own money to be up there. So it,
right,
I know it isn't easy, and unless you come from super affluent, the prices they're charging doesn't mean anything to you. But
right,
given the fact that I know those
right.
things and that you still put yourself up here for being voted on, you've got some skin in the game beyond just, oh, I want this seat. You put up some of your own money to make this happen. So
Absolutely. Yes.
what would you like to say to my listeners before we close out?
Well, Philip, thank you so much for the opportunity. I thank you. You reached out to me, and uh, you've opened my eyes to some things that I never really knew much about. So thank you for the opportunity. I think that voting is such an important thing. Even if someone says I'm not going to vote for you, Yang, that's okay. Just go and vote. It's our duty. It's our right to do so. And I think it's such a wonderful thing for someone to, spend some time and to do the research on the candidates. I encourage everyone to go to my website. It's scottyangforjudge2020.com. I also encourage them to Google my name. And there was an article that came out last week that I thought was just, it was such a well-written article, and it was in depth in terms of the analysis. It's Met News Los Angeles. They did a very, very extensive. They did a very extensive analysis, and the person who wrote it was very fair. I think gave both sides an opportunity to clarify any points they may or may not have had. And the Met News Los Angeles, after their analysis, and I'm honored that they endorsed me. And it was a lengthy analysis. It wasn't the LA Times who gave me 2 lines, which still sort of left me a little baffled as to, why they ultimately came to the decision that they did. But I would encourage them to look at everything, look at all the endorsements, come and see who they think they would want to have hear their case. I think that's always a good test to use for judges is who would you like to have sitting there listening to you? And when they've asked themselves that, and they're able to justify it based on what they've learned, I think they're going to come to a great conclusion. And I hope that after they've researched everything that, they will find that I am worthy of their support and their vote. And so I'm extremely grateful for that, and I'm grateful to you for the opportunity, Philip.
Oh no, it's been a pleasure. Honestly, it was educational for myself as well, and
Of
I
course.
can't wait to share this with the listeners. It's just one of those things that I think it's time to start making it a little more visible and a little more transparent, because a lot of this is a mystery to people who have their heads down
Yes.
busy with work and don't have
Yes.
the soft skills to do the research. Even if they're college educated, a lot of the times people just sit there and memorize things. So taking time to critically think and understand things isn't a skill that's encouraged by the public education system. So things like this that give me the
Yeah.
opportunity to sort of uh, publicly display how it is one can come to these conclusions, what kinds of questions they should be asking, and hearing from
Right.
people who are behind the scenes, who are in the trenches, doing the work, and giving that different perspective, the other side of why it is you might have the motive to want to. Because I do know that some people are elected by other officials, but then there are people who want to take a
Right.
chance to go further in their career, and that in itself is admirable, just learning about that transition in career. But then to also top it
Right.
off with the amount of public service that goes into the type of career you've chosen, it's really admirable.
I
And
appreciate that.
yeah, I appreciate
Thank
your
you.
time. Thank you
No, and
once
I appreciate
again.
yours.
And yeah, I'll share something with you once this is done. Sounds good.
Of course. Thank you. Thank you very
Yeah,
much. I
thank
appreciate
you.
your time. Take care.